Hi, everyone. I'm Anya Parampil, and this is Redlines. My guest today is Moscow-based international affairs analyst Mark Sleboda. Mark, welcome back to Redlines.
Anya, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Redline.
Well, let's discuss the situation in Ukraine, Russia. Things appear to be heating up. Russian military analyst Pavel Felgenhauer recently made a disturbing prediction, claiming we could witness the breakout of World War III by May. He says, quote, "The threats are growing and rapidly. Much is not discussed in the media, but we are seeing very bad signs. The crisis has the potential to escalate into a pan-European war, if not even a world one." What threats could he be referring to, Mark, or are these comments overblown?
Yeah, these comments are overblown. Pavel Felgenhauer is a self-proclaimed military analyst with no background either in the military or in any type of academic studies of security studies or anything of the like. He is the quote Russian military analyst who is always called on by the Western media to give them the talking points about Russia that they want, when they're looking to say something negative and often largely untrue about Russia. Or something to do with its military or foreign policy. His track record is pretty abysmal. And this is just case for the point. I did see a brief snippet of the exact quote that you mentioned by him. No, we are not on the outbreak of World War I. That is probably like a 0.0001% chance scenario right now. You don't have to head to your bunkers. You don't have to say goodbye to your loved ones. That is.
I'll just jump in. You said World War I. I want to give you the chance to correct yourself.
World War III, World War I. It doesn't make any difference, at least in the current situation with the civil conflict in Donbass, and even considering the backing on the Kiev side, the Kiev regime side by the West and NATO, and even considering the backing on the Donbass Republic side by Russia. It is extremely unlikely that Russia and the U.S. or Russia and NATO will end up going to war over this incident. And Ukraine is not a NATO treaty member, and U.S. or NATO is not going to send military troops into Ukraine or Donbass overtly to fight Eastern Ukrainians or Russians, the mythical Russians, in Eastern Ukraine. It's simply not going to happen. The U.S. knows that would be a nuclear red line for Russia, and there are some crazy people in the U.S. and NATO who would like to push something to just that type of bluffing scenario and would like to see NATO troops. But those are not the people who are in charge. Not to say that they're all good or wonderful, but they're a little saner than that. And the same must be said on the Russian side. So I do not believe we are anywhere near a military confrontation between Russia and NATO or the U.S. Over Eastern Ukraine. Chances of that are higher in Syria, if anywhere. And I would, there's always the possibilities of black swan events and change of misunderstanding. Someone accidentally shoots down a plane, but that is an infinitesimally small opportunity, chance. I'm more worried right now about a chance of renewed civil conflict in Ukraine with Kiev regime forces backed by the West, ending the ceasefire, the tottering ceasefire, and renewing a military conflict against Donbass. And that does have the potential to draw Russia into the conflict overtly.
Let's discuss that specifically. How has the situation in Ukraine changed over recent weeks. It appears as though things have escalated. Has there been a decisive change in policy from the United States, from where, as far as you can see, since Joe Biden came into office?
Okay, so there has been a big policy change since Joe Biden came into office. There has also been a big policy change in Kiev in recent months. And there is multiple political, economic, social crises going on in Ukraine at the moment, even outside of the Donbass conflict, that may be tempting Zelensky to seek a military solution of sorts with a renewed conflict in the East. And just a little bit of, I think you need to go back just a little bit in the background on this, and realize that we are still in the aftermath of the 2014 Maidan Push, where the democratically elected, if corrupt and flawed, just like every Ukrainian leader before and since, Viktor Yanukovych was overthrown in a protest and then violent putsch, which overthrew his government, drove him out of the country with open backing. And there is no doubt about orchestration by the United States, with Obama, official head of European and Eurasian affairs at the State Department, Victoria Nuland, and the U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey Piat, among many others, deciding, caught on tape, deciding who the next Ukrainian prime minister would be, walking around on the Maidan stage in the center of Kiev, cheering on protesters that were calling for revolution and the overthrow of the government. There is not a more blatant display of meddling that occurred that I can think of, right? In any other country, any other scenario. And this was not they depict it as a revolution of dignity moment. Oh, the Ukrainian people rising up and overthrowing a hated pro-Russian leader. First of all, Yanukovych was not a pro-Russian leader. He was an Eastern Ukrainian leader, and the best that could be said of him in that terms is he was not rabidly anti-Russian, which is pretty much the standard for what is considered pro-Russian now. He actually pushed and campaigned for the EU association agreement that was the supposed cause of these protests, up until the very end, when he got handed several thousand pages of neoliberal shock therapy diktat by the European Union. And he said, I can't do this. This is mass privatizations, ripping the country down to ground zero, nothing, even ripping the railroad tracks out of the ground, mass privatizations of state companies, unemploying over up to like half the population, tens of millions of people in state companies, and you're not offering any money, none, zero, to ameliorate the effects of the shock therapy. He was expecting like at least 15 billion. He got nothing. So at that point, he said, I'm sorry, not now, not under these terms, not without any money. And then he's like, well, let's see what the Russians have to offer, because our economy's in a really bad situation. And at that point, the green light went, and the West, led by the United States, went into full color revolution and regime change mode and openly backed the overthrow of his government. Now, polls taken during the Maidan revolution by actually at the behest of the International Republican Institute, one of the U.S. Color revolution gongos, and by polling agencies that are still used in Ukraine today, found that 1 month that 51% of Ukrainians were against the Maidan, a majority, and that the month after there were still 48% margin of error against the Maidan and only 45% supporting it, with the others not taking strong stance. So it's clear that it was half the country. It was the half of the country that lost the last election overthrowing the half of the country that won the last election. And you can easily take a look at any map of political polling, any election results in Ukraine for the last 2 decades, and see that there is a clear political and social divide between West and East Ukraine. West Ukrainians, they have a different history, particularly the far west, Galicia. It wasn't even part of Ukraine up until just the run up before World War II. It was part of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they are their sense of Ukrainian national identity is not necessarily pro-Western per se. Actually, at some point, the ultranationalists have a lot of contempt for the modern EU, but they are very, very anti-Russian. Now, in eastern Ukraine, you see the exact opposite conception of Ukrainian national identity. They see Russia as a brother people, the two countries and Belarus inextricably, linked together through history and culture and language. They are largely Russian speaking. We have to remember that up until the Maidan, the majority of Ukrainians in their households every day spoke Russian. And they, the media, books published, television, it was dominated by Russian, really. Was. That's not to say that people didn't know both languages. A lot of people did, but the majority of the population actually spoke Russian, and certainly in eastern Ukraine. So their sense is also, they have a very high sense of Soviet nostalgia, something that Western Ukraine hates. Because Ukraine is basically still stuck in the 90s. The oligarchs still, before the Maidan, after the Maidan, still run Ukrainian politics. We're talking about 10, 15 people, maybe. They own the television stations, they own the politicians, and they never had a Putin who, however harshly, drove the oligarchs out of Russian politics. That you get to keep your money from the 90s rigged auctions and so on, but you stay out of politics from now on. There was never that. Ukraine is still dominated by that oligarchic political dynamic today. And in Western Ukraine, they have a history that during World War II, Western Ukraine largely welcomed the Nazi invaders. They collaborated with them. They participated in the Holocaust. We're talking the Ukrainian Insurgent Army and the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. And the biggest, most well-known figure of that is Stefan Bandera. In the attempt after the Maidan Push to take control of the country, purge all the political representation and opposition to the Maidan, lustrate the then governing party of regions, ban the Communist Party and all other leftist parties in the country. This was an attempt to rewrite the political DNA and geopolitical orientation of Ukraine permanently to the West. And they needed this blank slate without any political representation of East Ukraine to do that. Now, this is a nation-building project, right? Nations are largely built. They have some limited amount of organic elements, but they do require a historical basis. And in order to create an anti-Russian Ukraine, the only real period of history they have to fall back on to create this is these World War II era Nazi collaborators, which is why in Ukraine today, after the Maidan Push in 2014, you see the celebration of these. These are the founding fathers of the country. They are the heroes whom it is actually illegal in the country to challenge that characterization of them now. And much has actually been written on that, and this rewriting of history in favor of Nazi collaborators in foreign policy of all places. And a lot of these West Ukrainian ultranationalists after World War II actually fled to the US and Canada. Large immigrants communities there, and all over the U.S. today, in the U.S. and Canada, you can actually find memorials to Nazi collaborators, right? most people don't know they're there or what they represent or so on. But they're there, and the U.S. had a long history of supporting Nazi collaborators in Ukraine, and the Baltics, it must be said, from the end of World War II all the way through the Cold War, the Forest Brothers, that whole episode's there, because, you know, the enemy of my enemy. These are our fascists, as Dulles once said. So there's a history there. And there is still this element. It's not to say that everyone on the Maidan was a fascist. And, you know, it's often derided as Russia saying they're Nazis. They're not Nazis. They're Ukrainian fascists, Banderite fascists, large numbers of them. That was the vanguard of the Maidan. And there was a point where they made an unholy union, I would characterize it as, with pro-Western liberals in Ukraine, that the way politically to defeat the political representation of East Ukraine, which was pro-Russian, Slovaks and the still at the time quite powerful Communist Party there, the way to defeat them was to join forces, a common cause against the Russianness, the ethnic Russians. You have to remember that some 35% of the Ukrainian population is ethnic Russian, and there's so much interbreed, families, part Russian, part Ukrainian. It's pretty hard to tell on either side. And full disclosure, my wife is Crimean. My in-laws live in Simferopol, and we have extended family throughout eastern Ukraine, Odessa, Kharkov, Donbass. So I would never make a claim to say that I am unbiased, but I do bring a perspective of the people in East Ukraine that is usually completely neglected from the Western media on the subject, and so on. Because according to them, the people of Eastern Ukraine, they have no agency. They're completely denied any agency whatsoever. They're just pro-Russian separatists, or occupied by Russian terrorists or Russian troops or so on, all of which is complete nonsense. This is a Ukrainian political conflict that was predicted as soon as you tried to make Ukraine make a firm decision, west or east, because of these two conflicting sides of Ukrainian national identity. And when the EU told Russia and Ukraine, you have to end your existing free trade agreement with the Commonwealth of Independent States, there will be no joint deals made. Ukraine has to make a civilizational choice. That fateful push, the Maidan, and ever since, is what has resulted in the civil conflict today. When we see the people in Donbass, the Donbass republics, they are those who, were not welcomed with a referendum into Russia like the Crimea was, but did not agree with the overthrow of the government that they had, Eastern Ukraine had overwhelmingly elected in 2014. Eventually, that ended in a frozen conflict, or not ended, but kind of petered out. And that's where we are today, with an attempt to re-escalate that frozen conflict. The comedian turned president, Volodymyr Zelensky, who was supported by the oligarch Ihor Kolomoisky. He actually had a TV show as a comedian where he portrayed a school teacher who was basically accidentally became the president of the Ukraine. And just a few years later, there was this space where, over 80% of the Ukrainian population polled at the end of the Poroshenko regime, the president, the oligarch, the Candy oligarch who became president after the Maidan. 80% of the Ukrainian population felt that Ukraine was moving in the wrong direction. His poll results were abysmal. He had the support of about 20% of the population going into re-election. And this comedian who promised a new face, uncorrupted by politics, east or west, of Jewish ancestry, and who promised to end the war in Donbass and try to restore some economic vitality to the country. After the 2014 putsch and the shift away from their major trading partner, the ending of that free trade agreement there, the shift towards the EU that invested nothing in Ukraine, Ukrainian GDP was halved. Halved. They became the poorest country on a per capita basis in Europe, poorer than Moldova. And that's saying a lot. So you can imagine what the Ukrainians have been through in the recent years. Unfortunately, he did none of that. He was not able to root out the corruption in the country. In fact, it's fair to say that it might have gotten worse. He has not ended the war in Donbass. In fact, it actually looks like he might be reigniting it. He has failed with the pandemic. The hospitals, the medical system in Ukraine, was basically overwhelmed. And the restrictions that he put in place to try to curb it with lockdowns were extremely unpopular because there was no government money being handed out to help people stay at home. Then with the vaccines, Ukraine wasn't able to get any vaccines because it turns out that actually Ukrainians are really, really low on the priority list of Americans and Europeans, and they're like, we're buying, 2 up to 12 times as many vaccines as we need. You don't get any, and they refused. The regime in Kiev refused to take Russian vaccines, Sputnik 5, because that vaccine is hybrid warfare against us, which is basically better dead than red, or Russian now in this case, in the reinterpretation. So they'd rather sacrifice their own people than take the political damage of accepting a vaccine from Russia. They're in a very bad situation with that there. There's a constitutional crisis in the country where Zelensky was basically ordered by the International Monetary Fund that the West has used to prop up the regime since 2014, the IMF spigot, tens of billions of taxpayer dollars poured into that black hole. They demanded certain reforms, and they created an anti-corruption unit, NABU, supposedly independent. That was, of course, actually used to go after the Maidan's political opponents selectively, of course, in eastern Ukraine. The Constitutional Court eventually decided that these reforms are unconstitutional and that this investigative organization used selectively, NABU, is an illegal, unconstitutional formation doing political work. And they demanded it all be shut down. Zelensky turned around and started trying to fire everyone on the Constitutional Court and replacing them with people loyal to him and will accept the reforms that the U.S. And the IMF is demanding. That's still ongoing. There's a political crisis in the country. Because of all of this, Zelensky's approval rating has dropped from 75 when he first took office some 2 years ago, down to 30% now. His party, Servants of the People, that he created at wholesale, is down even below that. They were completely wiped out recently in local elections, winning no mayorships anywhere in the country. Meanwhile, 7 years after the Maidan, the political representation of East Ukraine, after being lustrated, banned, pogrom, they've eventually reformed and regathered their strength as the opposition platform Party for Life. And by some polls, they are now the most popular party in the country, and they are certainly more popular than Zelensky's Servant of the People. What Zelensky has done about this, he has shut down the 8 media outlets representing East Ukraine. He's banned 3 TV stations entire. It's like if Trump had shut down MSNBC, CNN, and somebody else. It's blatantly cutting out the TV, the news, the media outlets that represent the political opposition, i.e. the political opposition of East Ukraine largely.
And the U.S. Embassy in Kiev actually celebrated this decision.
Yes, they did. They said it was countering pro-Russian media because Eastern Ukrainians don't hate Russia. I mean, that's that, and they're not allowed to have that view. And Zelensky actually said it erodes our values. I don't know what your values are, but they're not the same as the people in this part of the country. But I guess you get to decide what values they're allowed to have and not have. And on top of that, the leader of this opposition platform, he's another oligarch. Sorry, everyone in Ukrainian politics is an oligarch. Viktor Medvedchuk, I can't be said he's an angel, but he is leading the opposition party Platform for Life. He's reported in the Western media as a pro-Russian politician. Again, that's really nebulous. He's not necessarily pro-Russian. He just doesn't hate Russia. He's more pro-Eastern Ukrainian oligarch. He is now being pursued. He's now being charged with treason because of not defending the country rhetorically enough in 2014. It had nothing even to do with what he's doing now. And they're going after his assets and his family. And that's how he's attempting to deal with the resurgence of the political opposition in East Ukraine to the Maidan. And here we are now. There is also the question of Nord Stream 2. This is where it gets really geopolitical. This is the pipeline running from a second pipeline being constructed from Russia to Germany, which will be an energy hub spreading Europe out. There's already been one built. This is a second pipeline that would run under the Baltic Sea to Germany, bypassing existing land-based pipelines built during the Soviet Union that pass through Ukraine and Poland. Now, these pipelines have given Kiev a lot of political leverage over Russia through the years. And when Kiev has been unable or unwilling to pay their energy bills, gas is what's used for heating, just like in Europe and a lot of energy production, they have either cut off the flow of energy to Europe, claiming it's Russia's fault, or they have siphoned off gas intended for Europe for their own use. And Germany, very quietly, without admitting it, has had enough of that. That's why they agreed to the 2 Nord Stream pipelines. And the second one is some 95% complete. But the US, along, of course, with Kiev, Poland, the Baltic countries, are doing everything they can to kill that pipeline. The US is sanctioning not just the Russian companies constructing it, but the German companies constructing it, their own NATO ally. And there are 6 other European energy state majors, including BP and many others, Italy, France, that all invested in this pipeline. The US is trying to dictate the energy security of Europe. One, because the connections between Germany and Russia, they say we don't want any more connections there. 2, they would rather sell Germany their own liquefied natural gas at more than twice the cost and not even being able to provide enough supply, shipped across the sea. And there's the question of transit fees that subsidize the Ukrainian economy. Gas transit fees that are paid by Russia on one end and the German energy consumer on the other to Ukraine and Poland are run to billions of dollars a year. Last year, they were 18% of the Ukrainian the government budget. If they lose those fees, their entire economy is done. And this is why Putin said that the US is trying to make Russia continue to subsidize their geopolitical project in Kiev. So they regard this pipeline as an existential threat to their continued regime in Ukraine. So how do we get them to shut it down? This whole psyop, with the Russian far-right ultra-nationalist fringe figure with less than 2% support in the country, but loved by the Western media and the CIA. He was supposedly once again poisoned, this time with the most deadly poison in the universe. Novichok was sent by the Russian government over to Germany, where they diagnosed him with this. Russian doctors said he had none of that when he left us, at least. And he, of course, miraculously recovered in less than 30 days to full health, despite, according to accounts by Bellingcat and others, actually having his underwear poisoned. They literally, the accusation is they coated the inside seam crotch of his underwear with the most deadly poison in the universe, the poison too deadly to use, according to the New York Times, and poisoned Navalny's penis. But he miraculously survived it. Another lucky coincidence, because Russian government assassins are so incredibly inept at their work. I mean, that's the story we're fed. That failed to convince the Germans to cancel the pipeline. So what can they do now? The sanctions aren't working. Russians are still slowly, ships are still finishing the work. With all these domestic political crises and the Nord Stream and everything else going on, a little over a month ago, Kiev started shifting military forces back to the contact line in Donbass in large numbers. Tanks, artillery artillery systems, even ballistic missiles were seen transporting east, of course, along with thousands of conscripts. The Ukrainian military is mostly conscripts. And they've had quite a few years to recover since 2015. And they've been, trained and funded and armed by NATO countries, including the United States, since then. So they're a little bit more formidable force now. On paper, some 250,000 under arms. They've moved a lot of that to the east. This has been completely unreported by the Western press. It has been certainly noted in Russia and by commentators. I've been talking about it. I first tweeted about it on March 5th, so over a month ago. In the last 2 weeks, Russia, seeing this build up on Donbass, seeing that Kiev has now pulled out of the Minsk protocols, the agreement on paper between the regime in Kiev and the political authorities on Donbass to sit down and politically reconcile in a series of steps that would lead up to control, elections and the turnover of the border to Ukraine, along with autonomy for Donbass in eastern Ukraine, a political autonomy. Kiev has never implemented any of these measures. They have no intention of doing so. They refuse to even sit down and talk, to appear in the same space with the political authorities in Donbass, because that would question their legitimacy. How they got to power put them on a almost equal basis, where they would both have to make political arguments to the Ukrainian people. They can't allow that, because then their whole regime, their whole rewriting of Ukraine's geopolitical orientation might fall apart like a house of cards. So they've refused any of that. And now they've pulled out of the Minsk talks that were being held in Minsk, Belarus, because now they say suddenly Belarus is too close to Russia and we don't trust them anymore. So it's their way of pulling out of the Minsk Accords without actually pulling out of it. And it has to be remembered that the Minsk Accords are actually cemented in UN Security Council resolutions. So they are something that is supposed to be fulfilled according to international law at this point, to settle this civil conflict in Ukraine. And it was brokered not between Ukraine and Russia, but between Ukraine and the Donbass, with France, Germany, and Russia as the guarantors. So with all of this, Russia started to build up their military forces slightly at the border in response.
We are concerned by recent escalating Russian aggressions in eastern Ukraine, including the credible reports that have been emanating about Russian troop movements on Ukraine's borders and occupied Crimea. We're discussing our concerns about this increase in tensions in ceasefire violations and regional tensions with NATO allies, of course, and the other week in Brussels. This was a broad topic of discussions. We've asked Russia for an explanation of these provocations, but most importantly, what we have signaled directly with our Ukrainian partners is a message of reassurance.
Cue all the Western mainstream media headlines about Putin massing his forces at the border to go into, to invade Ukraine again. That's the story. Now, what is the reality? there have been some 25 to 30,000 Russian forces at the Ukrainian border since 2014, since the conflict there. Okay, that has been, just like there's Russian forces in Russia on the borders with NATO countries, where there's U.S. forces on the other, thousands of U.S. troops on the other side. It's the same situation here, because in the last 7 years, Ukraine has become kind of a de facto client state of NATO, if not actually a NATO member. The United Kingdom has even begun building naval bases in Ukraine, or they have plans to, at least. So Russia, as a deterrent, has begun a small buildup of military forces under the guise of what is, yes, actually exercises. But according to the New York Times, some 4,000 extra Russian troops are lingering at the border. And that is some titanic threat that the media is crowing about, and the governments are warning about. Now, Ukraine is a country of some, on paper, 45 million. There hasn't been a census in a decade. It's probably actually more like 35 million, but 35 million people. The idea that 30,000 buttressed by, say, 4,000 or 5,000 more is an invasion force is ridiculous. Okay, this is a defensive force on one side, and then a force that is supposed to deter Kiev from once again attacking Donbass and trying to settle the political conflict in the country militarily. It is a deterrent, and you don't have to take my word for it. Are you familiar with the Center for New American Security?
Good old think tank.
Yes, a think tank, a bipartisan Washington, basically a descendant of the old neocon PNAC, right, Project for New American Century. This is bipartisan because there's really no difference between the neocons and the liberal imperialists / interventionists anymore. And this was the premier foreign policy think tank of the old Obama-Biden administration. Well, they recently put out a talk, and I strongly recommend that you actually listen to this one. This is on their podcast, Brussels Sprouts, that they run regularly. And
that's actually the name of the podcast.
Yeah, that's the name of the podcast. No comment there. But anyway, they had a discussion with Michael Kaufman, who is a known military specialist. He is a senior fellow at CNAS. He's also at the Kennan Institute, and he's a senior research scientist at the Center for Naval Analysis at the Russia Studies Program. He knows what he's talking about with the Russian military, more or less. And also Maxim Samarukov, whom is a fellow at the Carnegie Moscow Center. And they sat down with two other people who regularly do the podcast there. And they recently had a talk. Russia's military buildup on the Ukrainian border with Ukraine. On the Ukrainian border with Maxim and so on. I strongly recommend you listen to this, because however grudgingly and however they tried to downplay the Ukrainian buildup that preceded the Russian military buildup, they go through all the usual mainstream media examples of why Putin is doing this, right? It's another land grab in Ukraine. It's all about Crimea and water. Well, if you don't know the situation, after the Maidan, the regime in Kiev built a dam to cut off the flow of water to Crimea. A literal crime against humanity to collectively punish the Crimean people for choosing wrong. Well, the water situation in Crimea is not good. The Russian government has tried multiple methods to solve it. In parts of Crimea, they only get a few hours of water in the pipes a day. And Russia has now, as a last step, has invested billions of dollars in giant desalinization plants to try to solve the problem. One of the theories is that Russia wants to seize the territory in Kherson, north of Crimea, to bring back that water supply. Of course, that would create a front line with Ukraine of much greater size than the tiny little fortified border at the Crimean Peninsula. It's simple geography, and it is widely regarded as something that would create infinitely more problems than just water shortages in the Crimea. So they dismiss that. They dismiss domestic political reasons, that Putin is doing this because of his approval rating, which is still some 63, 65%, and the fact that Russians actually aren't that crazy about military adventurism. It doesn't add or subtract from the polls in any given question about this sort of thing, or to distract from Navalny, who, after returning from Russia, has been put into prison for violating the terms of his suspended sentence for his fraud and embezzlement from the French cosmetics firm Yves Rocher. Of course, they're making a big stink about this. Oh, he's a political prisoner and so on. Meanwhile, the Russian people don't care about Navalny. They didn't care about him before. He had 2% support in the country, no matter how much his real constituents, the Western media and governments, love him. He's a fringe figure here. He's far right. He's an ultra-nationalist. His message does not appeal to the vast majority of the Russian people, and they don't care whether he's in prison or even what he's in prison for. All right, so that is nonsense. Russia is not having a mass military buildup on the Ukrainian border to distract from Navalny being in prison. Testing Biden. That's a big one. Biden is a new president, and all of U.S. enemies test an American president as soon as he comes into office. Right? This is like poli-sci or international relations 101. Like this, the most simplistic reductionist thing, that every other country in the world is not actually concerned about their own national interests in foreign policy, but they're all fixated on the United States. And a new U.S. president is there. We have to test him. This is American hubris and their belief that they're in the center of the world, rather than Russia actually has a lot of interests in Ukraine, and particularly Eastern Ukraine, especially considering that since the Maidan and the frozen conflict there, some 600,000 to 700,000 people in the Donbass have taken dual Russian-Ukrainian citizenship. So now Russia has some 600,000 to 700,000 citizens on that side of the Ukrainian border. That's not even counting the 2 to 3 million Ukrainians who fled into Russia for safety, the aggressor Russia, in 2014, and are still here, many of who took citizenship while they're here, or are still on some type of extended political refugee status. And then there's the idea of Russia somehow wants to reverse the status of being outside of this conflict and having it brokered by the OSCE, and they want to put a peacekeeping force there. This is all nonsense. The real reason is that Zelensky hopes to restart a conflict in East Ukraine of sufficient size to make Russia directly intervene to protect Donbass. Now, and make them return to the Minsk Accords, cementified by the UN Security Council resolutions, and a peaceful political resolution to the ongoing political conflict in Ukraine since 2014. Zelensky hopes that by forcing Russia to intervene, he can use that as leverage against the German government. Russia is invading us, all right? There'll be some type of provocation. It will be presented that way. And then hoping, with this calls to defense of Ukraine, that the German government will no longer be able to resist. It will also buttress Zelensky's abysmal approval ratings with a rally around the flag effect that will help take some of the political pressure off of him and give him more room to repress political representation in East Ukraine, perhaps ban the opposition bloc Platform for Life now. And third, there's a real possibility with the descent of his own party, the political problems in Ukraine, not even counting Donbass, and the rise of, the re-rise of political representation in East Ukraine some 7 years later, the new popularity of the opposition bloc, that all of this since the Maidan could be reversed, including the geopolitical orientation of Ukraine, naturally, like in elections. What is one way to ensure that the Ukrainian people really hate and cannot reconcile anymore with Russians? If you provoke Russia into a direct military intervention, and in so doing so, they kill thousands of Ukrainian conscripts from all across Ukraine, something that Russia overtly, I'm not saying they didn't support the people in East Ukraine. Of course they did, just like NATO supported the regime in Kiev. But if they actually intervened military directly and killed Ukrainians, that might be a break between the two countries that it is impossible to come back from at that point. And I think that might be one of the last political considerations. And I do believe that there are people in Washington who has obviously greenlit all of this and is encouraging it. They just landed some 350 tons of military gear in Odessa port in the last week, U.S. Military vehicles, adding fuel to this whole fire while the tensions are being built up. I think there are people that are willing to sacrifice, lots of Ukrainian lives for this. I believe that America would be all too glad, certainly the Biden administration, would be all too glad to have, to fight Russian influence in Ukraine in favor of their influence until the last West Ukrainian kills the last Eastern Ukrainian. I think they've made that clear. And with Biden actually bringing the neocon maven Victoria Nuland of Obama administration, who was one of the orchestrators of the Maidan, back into his government. I mean, this woman is the wife of arch neocon Robert Kagan. This is a really disastrous situation. Washington seems to be sending a lot of green lights. They've just announced that they're sending 2 American warships, an Arleigh Burke class destroyer and a missile frigate into the Black Sea. Bordering right off the coast of Crimea, bordering this whole conflict here. There is a lot of possibility for a military conflict there. I do not believe that Zelensky or Ukraine or Washington believes that he can recover Donbass by military force. He knows that at some point Russia would step in, particularly now with hundreds of thousands of citizens on that side of the border. But here's the thing. They don't actually want Donbass or the Crimea back. They don't. They cannot politically accept them because bringing some 4 to 8 million Eastern Ukrainian voters back into the country would definitely swing that political balance back in favor of the East with the current unpopularity of Zelensky's party. That's something they can't accept. They cannot politically reintegrate these people, not unless they stop these people from voting for another decade or more and then re-educate them, put them, lots of them in, concentration camps for separatists and the like. That is their only real possibility. Very quietly, a lot of people, the geopolitical thinkers of the regime in Kiev have quietly said, we don't want Donbass or Crimea back, but we have to pretend like we do for ultranationalist domestic political reasons. But this political goal of a renewed conflict, of using it to try to get Germany to kill Nord Stream 2, of buttressing Zelensky's approval rating, and of possibly severing Russian-Ukrainian relations forever. I think that's something they're willing to do. And This talk on CNAS, of course, doesn't support these latter conclusions, but they do admit, however grudgingly, that the disposition of the Russian military forces on the Ukrainian border is not large. It's not enough for an invasion force. It's a deterrent. They never actually say what it's supposedly deterring, but they, however grudgingly, come to that conclusion there. And even CNN reported this week, quoting a Defense Department official, that we do not see the amassing of Russian forces as posturing for an offensive action. That's according to the Pentagon. So despite that, the media headlines, rhetoric from politicians in the U.S. and Poland, in the Baltics and Kiev and elsewhere is all out of control. Russia, aggressor, mad Putin again. And, they're not considering what Russia's real interests here lie. And the fact is that if conflict is renewed in Ukraine and Russia goes in, Russia has escalation superiority in this situation. They have a border with Ukraine, right? There essentially right now is no border between Russia and the Donbass if Russia wanted to send its military in there. They can escalate, they can arm the people of East Ukraine much better, much more easily than the US can arm the regime in Kiev. And at the end of the day, Ukraine matters much more to Russian national interests than they do to the United States. How many Americans are convinced that suppressing the people of East Ukraine to accept the rule of Kiev, since 2014 is in the US vital national interests that is worth going to war with Russia over? I don't think too many Americans would actually, agree, with that type of sentiment. So what they're risk doing, if this plans with Nord Stream and stuff don't work out, is a repeat of the 2008 scenario with Saakashvili in Georgia, where the George Bush administration promised also the support in the world and armed and trained Georgia's military, convinced it to try to retake South Ossetia and Abkhazia, separate from them since before even the Soviet Union broke up, by military force. And of course, Russia, which had peacekeepers there, their peacekeepers were killed, and they went in force. And, the Saakashvili regime, its military forces, retreated in absolute defeat. And it led to, his government collapsing shortly after that, with the anger of the Georgian people that he led them into that situation. That type of situation could be, the result that comes out of these next few weeks. There's, I believe, a couple more weeks of buildup that will happen. The ground in eastern Ukraine and that area there is, like I said earlier, is extremely muddy right now. It's the spring thaw. It's not good for moving heavy military equipment. And it seems that Kiev still has some more military to ship to the east. But there is very much the potential for some renewed civil conflict in eastern Ukraine between the end of April and probably the beginning of July.
And coinciding with that time, Ukraine recently announced it will hold joint military drills with NATO this year. The World Socialist website reports, quote, while joint Ukraine-NATO drills are often announced with clarifying statements that they are purely defensive operations, the Ukrainian military statement differed in that it made clear that it would simulate an offensive attack against not only separatist-controlled Donbass, but Russian forces as well. How are these drills viewed in Moscow?
Well, it's very interesting because these are the statements out of Kiev, but they are not the same as statements out of NATO itself or the United States for that matter. So it would seem that, as has happened so many times, that Ukraine is running with this for domestic political reasons, not necessarily because it's going to happen. Now, there have been military drills, of course, plenty of military drills over the last 7 years between the regime in Kiev and NATO. that that does happen. To announce new drills without any firm date for them, and with this type of description of what it will be and where it will be, seems rather. It would be a very big provocation from NATO, from the United States, that I think a lot of NATO members, Germany in particular among them, would not approve of. And we'll see how much of this is real, but I'm not placing a lot of bets on it actually happening, at least not the way that Kiev has put out that they want it to.
Hmm. I wanted to ask you about Crimea specifically because the history there is quite interesting to me. I'm wondering if you could explain why the territory is so historically important to Russia and why, for over a century, European powers have been trying to take it.
Yeah. Okay. So Russia was first taken from the Crimean Muslim Khaganate, allied with the Ottoman Empire, back in the 18th century. And it has been part of Russia since then. It was also owned further back in history at times by the Kievan Rus princes and briefly empire in that period there, which was then Russia and Ukraine basically together. That is before the Mongol horde came in. Now, it is a mistake. It is wrong of Russians or anyone else to suggest that Crimea has always been part of Russia. That's nonsense. All right. You look back, Crimea as a peninsula has always been a crossroads of the world and intermingling of a lot of different cultures, starting with the Sumerians, the Greeks, and the Scythians, and then the Roman, the Byzantine Empire, the Venetians, the Goths. There's so many people that have been in and out of Crimea, then the Mongol horde and so on. It is impossible to say that Crimea historically belongs to anyone. All right. It's true that during the Soviet Union, during most of its history for the last couple hundred years, it has part of Russia, the Russian Empire, and Russia at the core of that. And it's true that Khrushchev, who was, it's widely considered that he was actually Ukrainian, transferred the Crimea to the official internal position as being part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, widely regarded as a birthday gift to his wife. That didn't really matter much at the time because it was all part of the Soviet Union. But when the Soviet Union split up, there was a lot of sentiment in Crimea to not be part of Ukraine and to be part of Russia. This was initially suppressed on both sides, Kiev because they wanted to keep it, Yeltsin because he didn't want any type of conflict and wanted to keep Bill Clinton, his buddy, happy. He was a U.S.-backed kleptocrat. So Crimea stayed part of Ukraine. But the population of the Crimea is some 80% ethnic Russian. And on top of that, the majority of the Ukrainian ethnic population, such as you can actually find a dividing line there, they're actually pro-Russian Ukrainians as well. In fact, you could really make the argument that Crimeans are and have been more patriotically pro-Russian than a good percentage of the population in Moscow, which is actually the most liberal city in Russia. And I have family there, so I am there regularly, and I can see it firsthand. The referendums, returned in over 90%, some 93% of people that said, all right, we want out of Dodge of Ukraine. The government that we elected overwhelmingly was overthrown. violently and unconstitutionally in a foreign-backed coup. And we're going to use this opportunity to rejoin Russia. And Russia said, yes, that's where our naval bases are. By treaty, we're pretty sure they'll be taken away, by the new regime that took power there, and the treaty's ripped up. So yes, please. Big geopolitical strategic reasons there for, accepting Crimea back into the fold. But, you don't have to take the Russian government's word on the referendum for it, because international polling, Gallup, Pew, GFK have all done polling there and have found that, yes, those are the results of the referendum. The people in Crimea did feel that way and do still feel that way. And if anything, the referendum might have actually underestimated the strength of pro-Russian sentiment there. And even with the question of the Crimean Tatars, this is a minority of the population, some maybe 10%. But polls taken by Levada, which is actually an independent pollster in Russia, which is actually considered a foreign agent here because it has been supported by funding from the West, they actually did polling a few years ago there that found that most of the Crimean Tatars, a plurality of them, felt that rejoining Russia was actually the right thing to do, and their economic situation is much better for it. So there's been an attempt to depict it as some type of repression of what is referred to erroneously as the indigenous population, but that's not actually true either. Not to say that all Crimean Tatars support it, but obviously a plurality did. So take that for what it's worth. But the historical argument to me does not matter and should not be made because of Crimean's history. What does matter is the people who live there now, the people who lived there at 2014. They did not want to be part of a government in Kiev that had overthrown their overwhelmingly democratic choice for president. They did not want to be part of an anti-Russian Ukrainian project. They wanted, and they took that opportunity to rejoin Russia. And the truth is, actually, a member of Zelensky's own party, a woman, went to the Crimea in the last few months, and she made a statement upon returning that actually, taking a look at the incredible economic change since Russia has invested so much money there, restoring the economy, bringing the standard of living up to Russian standard of living in the Crimea, that they're much better off now than they were before, than they would be in Ukraine. And there were calls to kick her out of his party and censor her and silence her. But that's a member of Zelensky's own party. So I think that's one sentiment coming from his party that I will actually accept on face value.
Speaking of Zelensky, he recently made comments asserting that the only way to end the war in the Donbass would be for Ukraine to join NATO. Is he serious here, or is this just more domestic posturing as you characterized it?
Okay, so this is definitely domestic posturing, right? The way to end it, everyone agrees, even officially the United States and certainly France and Germany, is to implement the Minsk Accords. But the regime in Kiev is afraid that they follow through on that political reconciliation, that they will, in the end result, lose control of the country, right? Bringing all these Donbass voters back into the country and being forced to debate them on an equal stage about everything that has happened in the country in 2014 and since. They won't implement it, politically. So they're left with a military situation they can't solve on their own. So they cry to, their Western backers, thinking that they will help them. But if NATO actually did militarily intervene, right, except against its own rules, Ukraine as a member, NATO requirements for entry, the basic requirements is that a country cannot have any type of territorial dispute or conflict, ongoing domestic. They I'm not saying that NATO would not get rid of their rules theoretically, but there is not European consensus on this. Germany would almost certainly not agree to this because they know that this would be a national security red line for Russia. Seeing Ukraine or Georgia brought into a enemy military organization that has thousands of troops decamped on their borders and has a history of aggression against countries around the world in the last few decades. Russia would not allow that to happen. It's a national security red line for them, any more than the United States would accept Canada and Mexico joining into some Chinese anti-American military alliance. Russia is simply not going to allow it. And there are plenty of people in Ukraine that do not want it. The last polls taken in Ukraine about NATO just in the last couple of years show that only around 51 to 55% of the Ukrainian population want to join NATO. And that's not even counting the millions of people in Donbass, and certainly not the people of Crimea, which are now consider themselves part of Russia. So there isn't even broad consensus among Ukrainians. And what if NATO, for some crazy reason, all of the countries of NATO agreed, as they would have to expedite Ukraine's entry without meeting the proper requirements, without being an actual military asset, everything, that would actually start a war. That actually is a potential World War III type scenario. But I don't believe that all of the countries of NATO are going to agree to do that. There's certainly a handful of them that would, and the US might be among them. Certainly Poland and the Baltics might be some others. But I don't believe that's going to happen. But if it did, that would actually cause a war, not prevent it.
Well, finally, then, Mark, since you've referenced the Minsk agreements throughout this conversation, I'm just wondering if you can give viewers an idea of what those accords actually would require the parties involved to implement. What is the gist of the agreement?
Okay, well, first of all, they require a real serious ceasefire with very specific requirements about pulling the weapons back and a long-term end to hostilities. They require the political leaders in Kiev to sit down with the political leaders in Donbass. That already is a step that the Ukrainians have refused to take. The Kiev regime Ukrainians, not the Donbass Ukrainians. It would require a constitutional change to give political a fairly broad political autonomy to the Donbass. The thinking there from the Donbass side is you overthrew the government that we elected once and then came at us militarily to try to force us to accept the change of government in Kiev. We want some guarantees of our own political situation, even inside Ukraine, protection of our language, Russian, and not forcing us into a geopolitical confrontation with what we consider a brother country. Then there would have to be local elections that would be held. That is problematic because Kiev would try to dictate what political parties could actually participate in that, because left parties are banned in the rest of Ukraine, and certainly they don't want the people that currently run the Donbass, that have been elected there, to participate in elections, that might result eventually in a change in government in Kiev itself. They don't want that equal status. It would also have to include a broad amnesty of everyone who has been involved in the conflict. It would require ending all of illegal military formations, which would mean all of these far right paramilitary organizations that participated in the Maidan, solidified, then came to participate in the beginning of the conflict with Donbass when the Ukrainian military was paralyzed. They were not willing to take orders from Kiev. They faced tens of thousands of defections in the military, the police, and the security services to either Donbass, which is where those militias came from, or to Crimea. By even a Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty account, 75% of the Ukrainian Navy defected to Russia or Donbass when the government was overthrown in Kiev. 75%. And that's something that, really should put what has happened in Ukraine in a very different perspective for a lot of people. There would have to be elections. These illegal military formations would have to be turned down. There would be a big disarming on both sides. And then the government in Kiev would be allowed to retake control of the border between the Donbass and Russia. And like I said, almost nothing of that has ever been met. And Kiev has made it clear that they have no intentions of doing so. And it must be said that actually, if you refer all the way to the EU association agreement that began all of this, less than 25% of the measures of the EU association agreement have actually been met 7 years later. Why? Because it would result in mass economic chaos, these mass privatizations and unemployments. And no Ukrainian president is going to let them happen on his watch. Yanukovych didn't agree to it. Poroshenko never implemented it, and Zelensky hasn't implemented it. The 25% that was implemented was the low-hanging fruit. So all of this that started it, that neoliberal shock therapy, has not even actually really begun to be implemented in the country either. That's kind of ironic.
Mark Sleboda, thanks so much for that very comprehensive breakdown of the situation in Ukraine. I'm glad you've quelled some of my fears that things are going to get too out of hand too quickly, but it still certainly isn't part of the world that we should be paying attention to. And I'm just surprised that it's getting almost no coverage in corporate media in the United States.
Thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun.